The Scythes or the Reapers are some of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game, but unfortunately outside of that, I kind of struggle to find a reason to actually use them. They tend to be outclassed by halberds as a polearm option, and even curved greatswords and great katanas outclass them as like a ranged slashing option. And I think they were lacking at least one of two separate things to separate them from the rest of those classes. And that's one, to have some type of unique skill that can be infusible onto these scythes. Kind of like how square off is for the straight swords and how that helps them separate from being outclassed by curved swords. If there was like a nice stance-based scythe skill, that would have been nice. Or I would have liked for them to actually have a unique and really good power stancing combo. Kind of like how the spears have this really good power stancing combo to stop them from being outclassed by thrusting swords. I would have liked if the scythes had that too, because unfortunately they share the exact same power stancing combo as the halberds, and I would have liked for them to actually swing a lot faster. Now the scythes are very similar to the halberds in that they're polearm options. Now the purpose of the halberds is that they're going to be like a ranged based version of a greatsword. They're going to do very similar damage, probably not be as fast nor do as much stance damage, but they are also going to have a lot more weapon skill options available to them. Whereas for the scythes, they're obviously going to be more comparable to the curved greatswords, because curved greatswords are a slashing type of weapon and they are going to get very similar damage to the scythes. Now unfortunately, they kind of get just as much range and damage as the curved greatswords, but just get less stance damage. Their movesets are also slower, and even the curved greatswords actually get more weapon skill options available to them compared to the scythes. But I think the stance damage is like the biggest turn off for me. The light attacks are actually perfectly fine. They actually tend to be faster than the halberd and do just as much stance damage as them, but the heavy attacks are so bad and just do awful stance damage. Like, these attacks are as slow as colossal weapons, but they do straight sword stance damage. But the only things that scythes might have that help separate them is that they can do bonus damage around shields and they can proc bleed. Now, them doing bonus damage around shields doesn't really mean anything because there's hardly any shielded enemies in PvE. And them doing bleed does make them pretty good. There are other types of polearm options that can proc bleed, like the Vulgar Militia Saw, and that can actually get some more weapon skill options, so it does have more of a use. But some of the scythes can do more damage, and there also isn't like a bleed-based curved greatsword. But since the release of the DLC, there is the existence of the great katanas, and these are like another hard-hitting, longer-range type of slashing weapon that also gets bleed, but these ones are just gonna hit harder, get a better moveset, get a faster moveset, and just do more stance damage while having a lot more weapon skill options available to them. Now, even then, in that case, every single one of these scythes do have their own like specific use. So it's not like every single one is completely outclassed or useless, as we'll get into and cover. But as I did mention, I kind of wish they did have their own type of unique skill or a better power sensing combo. Starting off at the bottom, the Winged Scythe, which is a dexterity and faith-based Reaper, and by no means is this thing a bad weapon at all. It actually does net you some decent damage, does have the worst range in class, but it's not by much. You can get it very early on in the game, and it requiring Somber Stones means that it's very easy to upgrade as well. Now, the fact that it does actually do some split holy damage means that it's still not going to be the highest damaging option, as like a lot of enemies in the base game are very resist to this type, and unfortunately it does have to compete with the Halo Scythe, which is like another early game Somber-based option that also is dexterity faith-based. But the thing is, the Halo Scythe just gets the much better skill in my opinion. It doesn't get as much damage as the Winged Scythe, but I'm still going to prefer it a lot more. Because yeah, the skill for the Winged Scythe, Angel Wings, is kind of like a reskinned version of Loretta's Slash. Now thankfully it actually is better than Loretta's Slash. It does actually do a lot more stance damage, does do more damage, and it does stop NPCs from healing with a Crimson Flask, which is going to be more of like a PvP type of perk, but it does have some uses in NPC fights too. But it still performs perfectly fine in PvE. It is going to be like a nice heavy attack alternative, because as I mentioned, the heavy attacks of the Scythes are awful, and you could just use this attack to help stance break instead. It can close in the distance nicely, it can stun lock smaller enemies, but when you're fighting those larger enemies that can't really get staggered, especially in the DLC that have these like shorter openings, it's not going to be the best thing to use their attack, especially because that you could just use a light attacks, and then at the time that you use like the skill or even a fully charged heavy attack, you could just use the light attacks like a few times and just do more damage and do more stance damage. And in that instance, if you're going to be light attack spamming for the most part, you're just better off going in another direction. Like, it is a very easy to use weapon that gets some decent stance damage, and it is very easy to upgrade, so it might serve as a decent early game option, but there's going to be much better options for you out there once you get later in the game. Number 4, just the regular basic Scythe. Now this weapon is one of two infusible Reapers, this one being the one that scales better off dexterity, and then the other one being the Grave Scythe, scaling better off strength. Now the Grave Scythe does actually get you a lot more damage in basically every single infusion, but that is not to say that the Scythe is actually useless by any means, because this weapon, one, doesn't have to be farmed unlike the Grave Scythe, is going to be lighter, have less requirements, and I think it's the better option with an occult build, and this thing does get a better moveset too. Because yes, this thing does get this nice double swiping heavy attack, which is just like the direct upgrade of like the regular Scythe heavy attack, which is just terrible. And this attack is basically just as long, but it just swings twice. therefore it's going to proc bleed faster, be better with multi-hit talismans, and just do more damage in general. So I think the only use of this weapon is to go into an occult build going into charged heavy attacks. Now the reason why I specifically say with an occult infusion is because the Grave Scythe actually has like a terrible arcane scaling with an occult infusion, and the regular scythe actually gets not that much less damage, but it just obviously gets more range and it gets a bunch more blood loss build up. But the reason why I still wouldn't really care to pair it alongside other different types of skills is because the Vulgar Militiasaur exists, and this is another Polearm type of bleed weapon, and this one could just do more damage and is paired nicely alongside the other different types of skills, because you could use things like Spectral Lance or Stormcaller and they could just do more damage than you can with a scythe. So the only use that it does have is with this charged heavy attack build, and it is pretty decent. It does do pretty nicely. Now the thing is, it's still just really long. Like this heavy attack is like longer than a colossal weapon heavy attack, and I just don't really know why, because it only does 33 stance damage, which is just as much as like a straight sword or a spear. Like this heavy attack should be like almost twice as fast, because it does do good damage and it can help proc bleed pretty quickly, but it's not that powerful to warrant it being such a long animation. So it's a decent weapon, but it only has this one build. Number 3, the Obsidian Lamina, which is definitely one of the cooler weapons to come out of the DLC. It is a primarily dexterity-based weapon with a little bit of an arcane scaling. Obviously, it does get that split bleed build-up and does share the exact same heavy attack as the regular scythe, which, as I just mentioned, is like the best scythe heavy attack, but it's still not going to be by much because it is still a very long animation for only straight sword stance damage. But thankfully, its skill is going to be amazing, as it does serve as like a nice iframe dodge with like a bunch of these follow-up attacks that don't consume much FP, do some nice damage, nice stance damage, and can help proc bleed pretty quickly. So the way I'm talking about it, it might seem like it's an A, potentially even S tier weapon, but this skill is like almost identical to the Bloody Hellas and just worse in almost every single way. Like the only thing that the Obsidian Lamina does better than the Bloody Hellas version of this skill is that you can actually dodge in any direction while locked on, which is pretty nice and convenient. But if you just like lock off with the Bloody Hellas, you basically get this exact same effect. Now the reason why I do prefer the Bloody Hellas over the Obsidian Lamina, and the reason why I consider it to be this heavily outclassed, is because it quite literally gets more damage, it's the better weapon class, gets a better moveset, more bleed build up. This skill literally just like hits for more damage, does more stance damage, it's faster, does piercing damage, it has a faster animation. Like it's just better across the board in almost every single aspect. Like the Obsidian Lamina should have had like at least another thing outside of just like more directional control with the dodge. Like it should have had at least something else different, maybe like more damage or more stance damage. Like it does get an extra swing with a follow-up attack, because the Bloody Hellas follow-up attack only hits twice, whereas the Obsidian Lamina hits 3 times, but it's such a long animation that actually makes it more risky. It does have like this retreating back animation, which can actually help you out in some cases, but it's still going to be a lot safer if you just use the Bloody Hellas skill. So basically the only reason you actually want to use the Obsidian Lamina is because you think it looks cooler, and that's it. Number 2, the Grave Scythe, which is the other of the infusible scythes I'm going to touch on. And this one I consider to be the best one, as it does just get the most amount of damage. Now, unfortunately for the Grave Scythe, it suffers from being a scythe, therefore its moveset and DPS is not going to be that good. And honestly, I think there is only one build option for the Grave Scythe, and that is a heavy infused Spinning Strikes Blood Flame Blade build, and that is it. Like this is like the only optimal build that the Grave Scythe does have, because anything else it's just going to be outclassed by something else. With an Occult Infusion, the regular scythe and even the Vulgar Militiasaur get way more bleed build up, but for very similar damage and range, because this thing just gets a terrible arcane scaling with an Occult Infusion. But thankfully with a heavy infusion, it gets really good damage, somewhat even comparable to like a Great Hammer. Now Great Hammers actually still unironically have a faster moveset and just do way more stance damage, but scythes do have the ability to be infused with Spinning Strikes, and thankfully this skill alongside this build is actually kind of cracked. The weapon skill does spin around a whole bunch really quickly and actually help proc bleed fast, and literally a strength build with Blood Flame Blade gives it just as much bleed build up as like a high arcane occult infused Grave Scythe. So you're just going to benefit the most off this particular build, and you're going to proc bleed very quickly. And as you can see in the gameplay, against a bunch of different types of bosses, it's just going to destroy them and shred them very quickly. Now unfortunately this skill doesn't really get much hype Brahma, and it is going to result in you having to get like a longer opening. So against a lot of other bosses, especially in the DLC, you're probably going to have to use like the Iron Jar Aromatic just to be able to trade out. Otherwise you just have to resort to just using a different skill, or just using like the regular light attack combos, which if you're using a different skill or light attack combos, other different types of bleed weapons are just going to do those types of builds better. So it is a pretty decent weapon, gets some nice damage, and it is going to perform very well with some of these polearm types of skills, but yeah, unfortunately it's not very versatile. And that's number 1, the Halo Scythe, which is like a pure example of this game just having the skills be so broken to the point that even if the weapon sucks, it still can be an S tier option. Because yes, this weapon is kind of like a quality based scythe and gets like a really bad faith based scaling, And unfortunately, if you want to benefit off the damage with the skill, you're gonna have to spec into a lot of faith. So it kind of ends up being like a Dex Faith weapon anyway. And the damage is actually like some of the worst compared to all the other scythes. It also does get like the really poor scythe heavy attack with that this long animation. Now thankfully scythe light attacks are just still fine enough to like make up for it. And just like all the other scythes, it still does proc bleed. But yeah, the weapon skill is going to be the lone reason why this thing is going to be an S tier option, because Miquella's Ring of Light is one of the best projectile attacks that this game has to offer. It is a holy based ring projectile that is very similar to like the Sacred Ring of Light's Ash of War, and you might think that just the existence of that makes this weapon useless, but the Miquella's Ring of Light skill is just way better. It does like roughly 20% more damage. It goes like way further, like I mean incredibly far. Like this thing is like a really good sniping based option, and as I always mention, projectile attacks just cheese the entire game, and also the skill projectile does actually stagger these like larger enemies like knights and omens, whereas Sacred Ring of Light does not. So it can just like infinitely stun lock all of these enemies too, while only consuming 11 FP, which is just 2 more FP than the Sacred Ring of Light. And the fact that you're going to spam this skill over and over again means that a lot of bosses are just going to die very quickly, even if they are resist to holy damage. As long as they're not 80% resist to holy damage, then you're going to be perfectly fine. In those instances, you can just slap on Catch Flame and you'll be right. But this weapon has only gotten better as of the DLC due to things like the Sword of Light, and that a lot of enemies in the DLC are weaker to holy damage, so holy weapons just inherently got better, and the Halo Scythe being one of the better ones. Like the weapon itself doesn't get the most amazing damage or the best moveset, but the fact that you get passive bleed and an overpowered skill is enough reason for me to put this thing into the S tier and for it to be the best Reaper in the game. Okay, that is the video now done and complete. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is going to be the whips. Yes, the whips. There's like 7 or 8 whips and they all kind of suck, so I'm not really looking forward to doing that video, but it has to be done, so definitely do subscribe for that. And yeah, catch you guys around. Bye.